Hello and welcome to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. I'm Dr. Nerida, professional equine nutritionist, founder of the My Happy Horse Nutrition app, and owner of approximately 360 joints that are starting to get just a little bit creaky with age, which, given my very non-existent athletic career, is really nobody's problem but my own. But joint health for your horse, that is a very big deal, and that is exactly what we are talking about today. What actually works, what doesn't, and what you can do right now to give your horse the best chance at a long and sound life. Today I am back with two of my favourite guests, Dr. Brian Nielsen and Renee Harbowy from Michigan State University. You'll know them from episodes 12 and 13, and if you haven't listened to those yet, go back and do that because these two are just brilliant. Renee has just had her research paper published looking at whether joint supplements actually improve lameness in horses with osteoarthritis. We talk through what she found and why the results matter for every horse owner spending money on glucosamine and chondroitin. We also get into the anatomy of a joint and what osteoarthritis actually does to joint tissues, because understanding what is happening inside the joint changes how you think about managing it. From there, we talk about prevention, the 5 things Renee considers most important for long-term joint health, why movement is so critical for cartilage, what the research says about stalled versus pastured horses, and how nutrition from conception onwards sets the foundation for a horse's lifetime soundness. Brian also shares some research on bone that is fascinating, and we have a really honest conversation about corticosteroid injections, what they actually do, and what they don't do. And we finished with the myths both Brian and Renee would most like to banish from the horse world for good. There is a lot in this one. It's a good one. Let's get into it. Renee and Dr. Brian, welcome back to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast.
Thanks for
I am
having
so
me.
glad to be here. We're excited about this. This will be fun.
I'm so happy to have you back. I was sitting here preparing and in that little bit of a I need to be ready, and went, oh, this is Brian and Renee. This is going to be so much fun. So it's it really is great to have you back. So Renee, first of all, congratulations, because your paper on the joint supplement research that we've discussed in a previous podcast has literally just been published. And that's a huge accomplishment. So well done. And it's perfect timing for this. And I will put the link to that paper in the show notes for everyone. So if anyone's interested in going and reading Renee's full research on joint supplements that we have discussed previously, it will be there in the show notes for you. Let's start out there. I think we've discussed it at length in the podcast, but it's kind of like, I find with joint health that the joint supplements are kind of like the elephant in the room. So let's just talk about the elephant in the room. And can you recap for us? And I know it's a lot. And if anyone wants to listen to the full podcast, it's a 2-part series with Brian and Renee on this research. But can you just recap briefly what your study was, what you found, and what you'd like horse owners to take away from it?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, we worked with a summer camp in kind of the middle northern part of Michigan, and they have, being that they're a summer camp, plenty of horses that are not quite as sound as they used to be, right? So we took 40 of their geldings that had chronic lameness attributed to osteoarthritis, and I'm assuming since our paper's out, we're okay to name drop here a little bit. Okay, so they were fed Equine ASU for 6 weeks, and this is kind of just based on the label recommendation as far as how long you would expect to maybe see some changes in your horse. So for that 6 weeks, every 2 weeks of that, we measured their stride length, their lameness grade, as well as their gait symmetry. And the moral of the story is that over 6 weeks of that supplementation, we really did not see that the supplement was able to improve any of those parameters, which kind of tells us that a joint supplement is probably not going to be the thing that's going to help your horse get back to where they used to be. So essentially, once that lameness attributed to arthritis is already set in, it doesn't look like, at least this product in particular, in 6 weeks is going to be able to improve that lameness.
So it's a fear thing though, isn't it, for horse owners? Because, I've talked about your research with a number of people since we did the original podcast. And I think you said it too in the podcast, is that people are so worried about their horses developing osteoarthritis that they want to do something that might prevent it. And it's that not really knowing if it's going to help, but hoping that it will, maybe, that keeps them feeding these supplements.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of like our anecdotal evidence of success. There's a lot of people who feed it and really feel like it does result in improvements in their animals. And I think one interesting thing that we kind of saw over the course of the study is that we did see changes in lameness grade and gait symmetry over time, but those changes were irrespective of treatment. So a lot of times when someone's telling you about how a product really improved their horse's soundness or they're moving much better than they were before they put them on the supplement, it's also really important to be aware of any potential like confounding factors that happened around the same time that you introduce that supplement. So yeah, they still remain very popular, even though we really don't have any evidence that they work, particularly in horses that are already lame. So they already have arthritic changes, things like that. But I think a lot of people probably have those confounding factors, that changes with time, changes with season, or they change up a bunch of things at the same time that they add in a supplement, right? And it can kind of make it seem like maybe the supplement is what's helping, even though it's for the others.
So my brain is just split in two different directions here. And one of them is the direction that this whole podcast is going to go, is that, maybe joint supplements don't necessarily like help once a horse is arthritic, but there's all these other things that we can do, which is what we're going to talk about. But I just want to ask you, Brian, actually two things. Are you going to break your chair in this podcast recording?
I do get kind of casual. I was just again in a 4 hours and 15-minute long Zoom meeting, and this is how I'm glad my chair reclines a little bit.
Because remember, you broke your chair at the end of the last podcast that we did.
I do recall that. Part of it is also old age, and I can't see anything close up anymore, so I need to be far away. So there's reasons I lean back.
Oh no, I wasn't actually pointing out that you were leaning back. It's just that you, at the end of the last podcast, you said to us once we stopped recording, you said I wasn't being really interested. I just broke my chair and I couldn't lean back on it anymore.
Yep.
But the thing that came to mind when Renee was speaking then is the human joint supplement studies where they showed a significant improvement in osteoarthritis, like pain or whatever it was. I can't remember what they were measuring in the supplemented people, but they found the same effect in the placebo group.
Yes.
So
yes.
There's potentially some placebo effect here happening with the humans. Yeah, we've just spent a lot of money on a joint supplement. We've fed it to our horse. We want to see a difference, and then we can find that difference if that's kind of where. Is that part of what you think is going on as well?
Yes. And actually, again, to describe that one study that I think you're talking about, there's like close to 1,600 individuals in the study, a placebo-controlled blinded study. And they had a control group. They had a group that had just glucosamine, a group with just chondroitin sulfate. None of those showed any difference from the placebo. And then they had one where it was combined. And I always like to share like 66.6% of those people saw improvement. And that sounds impressive until you realize the placebo had 60.1% show improvement. And it wasn't even statistically different. It was they provided some weak evidence for maybe something there like a p-value of 0.09. And I always say, if we have a horse study where we have 5 horses per treatment or 6 horses per treatment, and we show a p-value of 0.09, we think, well, maybe if we added a few more horses. Yeah, when you have like almost 1,600 people, but the paper didn't discuss whether or not, or the how the substances were delivered. So for instance, did the placebo get 2 pills per day, glucosamine 2 pills per day, glucosamine chondroitin sulfate 2 pills per day, but the combined one got 4 pills per day? Because if you're actually taking in more pills, there's lots of studies that show the more expensive a placebo is, the better it works. So if you're taking more placebo pills, it should theoretically have a stronger placebo effect.
Yeah, right.
But at the same point, if you need to move into hundreds and hundreds of individuals to detect a little bit of a difference, how much is it worth? And there's also other human studies with thousands of individuals. And again, it backs up, it doesn't really show anything. But I actually, speaking of humans, I am one. Some people might
Sometimes.
question that. So, way back in the late 90s, when this was really becoming popular, I was doing my first marathon and I was having some knee pain because that happens. And we were beginning to do research on this. So I'm thinking maybe there's something there. I go and to the pharmacist and ask which type they recommended, and the pharmacist indicated. And then she said, "Oh, and a lot of people have good luck with or positive results with shark cartilage too." And I said, "And I believe in the placebo effect also." Um, I didn't see any difference with the glucosamine. I never tried the shark cartilage. But what made a difference is when I was done running that stupid marathon and quit running on a regular basis those long distances, and when I changed up my running shoes and got new ones. So it goes back to what Renee was talking about, these confounding effects that we change up at the same time. So, rarely as a runner, rarely is my soundness always exactly the same. It is changing over time, and that's what you expect. And if you've been putting your horse on this and you're seeing positive effects because the horse is lame, you're saying, well, it was the joint supplement that did it.
Mm,
If you don't see an improvement, it's like, well, yeah, it didn't work with my horse, but it might work with somebody else's horse.
mm, mm.
But
And
really
it's
good studies, it doesn't show that, because it does show they change, but not based upon treatment.
yeah, and I think it's true too that, and this is what you're saying, I think, Renee, is that they'll change one thing, but then we change all these other things. So if you feel like your horse is a little bit sore, you wouldn't go and give them a long trot down a hard road, or like you kind of you just sort of, as a horse person, you naturally know how to look after a horse a little bit in terms of like its joint. And then if you put it on a joint supplement as well, it's really easy to go, well, the expensive joint supplement I just paid for has actually made that positive change, when in actual fact you've looked after them. Which is maybe a nice segue into the actual subject of the podcast, is all these other things, like what can we do to look after the joint health of our horses, because it is such an important part. I'm getting a little bit younger than you, Brian, but I'm getting to the age where I'm starting to feel my joints more. And so, personally, it's becoming a thing of like, how do I look after my own joints? And it's a massive thing for our horses too. If they're in joint pain, they're not going to be able to do the best thing. But I was asked to write an article about joint health, and I'm like, oh my goodness, this is not really, I've never worked with joint supplements because I never felt that there was the research there to allow me to formulate a joint supplement. So I've not ever worked with one. And consequently, I do a lot of work with joints in young growing horses, lots and lots of work in the thoroughbred and standardbred industries with growing horses and looking after their joints nutritionally. But I discovered when I was writing this article that my mental image of a joint was the cartilage surface, and that's not quite what a joint is. So can you just explain, in terms that I would understand, not being a vet or a physiologist, what actually makes up a joint? Because there's lots of parts to a joint. It's not actually just the cartilage surface that we're talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the cartilage is easiest to think about because everybody's pretty familiar with it. And I say that it's probably our most like challenging tissue. So it gets all of the attention, right?
Mhm.
But yeah, so our cartilage is, especially in our diarthrodal or like our synovial joints, is kind of what covers the bone and absorbs kind of compressive forces and lets those bones like slide and glide over each other when the joint is moving.
Mhm.
But then that cartilage is nourished by our synovial fluid. So that's a really important aspect of maintaining joint health. And that synovial fluid is produced by the synovial lining, which is kind of the innermost part of the joint capsule. So you need to have a healthy synovial lining. And then the capsule as a whole is also going to help provide some structure and support to the joint. It's kind of like it's a capsule. I was going to use the word encapsulates, but it encapsulates that cartilage and the synovial fluid, right? In case you guys wanted another synonym for the word capsule.
Okay. So there's actually like it's actually encapsulated here. I'm going to do the same thing as you now. It's hard to find another word to describe this, but like, is it like a membrane or something that holds
Yes.
everything? Yeah, right. So there's a membrane around the whole joint. And then because the tendons and ligaments and stuff must come in through there, because something has to attach to the bone somewhere. So they're a part of it.
Yes, your ligaments, I would say, are also a very like kind of like the next step. And as I think of as we like zoom out of the joint. So our ligaments are what hold bone to bone, right? So I can have ligaments that are outside of that joint capsule. And then you can also have ligaments that span like inside the joint capsule. And then there's some that'll even like tie into the capsule directly, just dependent what joint you happen to be like talking about. So I think humans, if you're thinking about your knee, people are pretty aware of like their MCL. Your MCL would be one that's like outside of your joint capsule, whereas like your ACL in the middle of your knee is like inside that capsule.
Okay.
So that's just an example of like the different ligaments can live in different places, but it's really important that those remain pretty healthy as well, because that's kind of our next line past our joint capsule that is providing stability to the joint, right? Because the joint needs to be able to move,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't want it to just move anywhere at
Mhm.
any time, right? It needs to move in a controlled fashion. And then kind of the maybe the sort of like last thing that I think of with our joints, which I think we kind of sometimes think of as being like outside of the joint realm, is really kind of our tendons. But our tendons are what connects muscle to bone, right? And when that muscle contracts and pulls on the bone, it moves the joint, right?
Mm.
So you also need to make sure you have good muscular health and tendon health in order to be able to move the joints appropriately. And if you have like tendonitis, you can get swelling around the joint as a whole that creates stiffness, and then the joint's not moving as well. So really joint health kind of turns into this really kind of whole body approach, because you need all of those different systems working together in a healthy capacity for the joint as a whole to remain healthy.
Mm, it's huge, isn't it, when you start thinking about all of the implications
Mhm.
of, and I think I feel this in my own body, like when I'm, being
Yeah.
really good and doing Pilates and having all the like the core strength and my muscles working well, then my joints feel great. And then when I don't do that, they don't feel so great. But so this is, I mean, it's a massive topic when you look at it like that. But if we bring it back down to what's going on
Mhm.
inside the joint capsule, the encapsulated bit, and have a look. So it's osteoarthritis is really what the supplements that you just did the research on are targeting, and that then is primarily concerned with maintaining the joint cartilage surface.
Yeah. Yeah. So osteoarthritis affects both like the cartilage and the subchondral bone. So your cartilage sits on top of your bone, and your layer of bone right between the cartilage and like what we generally think of as bone is kind of that subchondral layer. So it can affect both of those. And just very broadly, what you see with osteoarthritis is kind of degeneration of those tissues. And so when we talk about providing that smooth gliding surface, resisting those compressive forces, and kind of working as like the shock absorbers as you move, as those tissues start to kind of deteriorate, you get less and less of that. And then that's where you get your mobility issues coming in, the discomfort, all of that.
Okay. So my next question for you is how much of joint health is actually preventable? So, we look at horses and they've all got their own genetics, they've all got their own conformation, they've all had their own athletic use. How much, like, if we manage them and do all the things that we're going to talk about, how much can we prevent it, and how much is something that we have to accept as is likely going to be a part of at least some horses' lives?
Yeah, I think how much is a hard question to answer, to be completely honest. I think it really,
Yeah.
like you're saying, depends on a lot of like the individual qualities of the horse, but it's definitely a combination, right? So we know that there can be genetic predispositions to like our developmental orthopedic diseases, our degenerative joint diseases. So there's some horses that might just be predisposed to developing these types of conditions. Additionally, like if a horse is maybe poorly bred, doesn't have great conformation, well, we can probably expect that they're not going to move the most correctly. Maybe they're not loading those joints the way we would hope that they would be, and so they could be at a higher risk. And those are things that we as horse owners don't necessarily have control over.
Mm.
I can like sit here from my desk and say like we should only breed like the best horses, but that's not gonna stop anybody, right? So
Mhm.
we're always gonna have some conformation problems. There's always gonna be that. But I always like the phenotype that our horse is going to show is always your genetics and your environment, right? So I can have a horse that is maybe predisposed to developing joint issues, but with really great management, I can kind of ward it off a little bit, or maybe it won't become completely debilitating. I could also have a horse that has really no predisposition to it. Maybe every horse in its lineage has been super sound. They have great conformation, but I could manage the horse horribly or completely overwork it, and I can induce these joint problems.
Mm.
So it is definitely not an inevitable disease, but it's not one that's also 100% preventable. And that can make it actually very frustrating.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting just watching individual horses, like just a few horses that I've bred over the years and horses that I've had that I know have not come from a good nutrition background
Mm.
and that have developed really quite significant arthritis later in life versus ones that I know have come from a really good nutrition background. And you know, one of them I've got at home is 23 this year and his joints are perfect. Mind you, he didn't do much work in his life either. So there's that confounding factor too. But yeah, it's what you say is that so much of it depends on what happens to them
Yeah.
throughout their lifetime. I love you as a scientist too, by the way, Renee. I love that you just told me that how much is a really hard question to answer. I'm like, yeah, that is a
Yeah.
really that's a really it is.
Renee is amazing at how she really takes these things and boils them down to very easy to understand language. And she does things very scientifically based, and I love that. And she's also very practical. And I love her response she gave. And I actually want to touch on something you just said, Nerida, about your horses not doing much or the whatever. So it's unlikely that it has some issues. 100% agree. You have some that, man, they're going to have a much easier time staying sound, and you're going to have ones that have much more likelihood of developing problems. And then there's all those in the middle. And what saddens me is that I do believe we have a lot of them in the middle that are creating or that are having joint problems because of how we manage them.
Mm.
And again, I'm certain we're going to talk nutrition, we're going to talk exercise, but I do think a lot of it is caused by things that we do have control over. So again, genetics gave it a bad draw of the cards, but so many of the other ones we shouldn't be having the joint problems that we have in our horses these days.
Mm.
That's my opinion on this. So much of that is human induced by doing the wrong types of exercise. And by the way, sometimes we have to do the things that might cause problems. I get that. But there's a lot of stuff we do that I think if we could minimize it, it would help us out a bunch.
Which leads us perfectly into my next question, and something that really stuck with me that you said, Renee, in our previous podcast was, and I'll paraphrase. I'm not going to get your exact words, but it was something about people are so focused on using a supplement to prevent joint issues that they then forget that there's all of these other things that we should be doing. And in fact, you know, if they're using an ineffective supplement, then they're actually putting their horse in and you didn't say this is me saying this now, but they will actually put their horse in a worse position because they think they're doing what they need to do, but they're not. And they're missing out on all of these opportunities to do things that will help with their horse's joints. And there's lots they can do. So can you give me the top 5? Like, what are the top 5 things we should be taking into consideration when we're thinking about a horse's long-term joint health? And I've kind of led the witness here in the questions that I sent you because I put nutrition first. So it's obviously one of them. But what are the others? And generally, like, this is not, I mean, I have horses and have had for a long time, but it's not something that I've thought about a lot. So I'd love to know what the other 4 are.
Okay, yeah. I think it's tricky, and I think sort of the way I approach the question is kind of, I recognize that I can talk about the horse's whole lifespan. Most people might not own their horse for its entire lifespan, right? So kind of one thing that I think we already like sort of touched on is, of course, like the horse's breeding. We've talked about this, that not every horse needs to be bred, right? So I think when we talk about like ensuring that horses have good conformation, being set up for success, like from that kind of perspective, just when people actually do their due diligence in breeding their horses and producing a quality horse, it's not only for us as horsemen to have a quality horse to show, but that horse, by being of a slightly higher quality, is probably going to be more successful in its career and just maintaining its soundness, being comfortable. Because if we're breeding good horses, they tend to also be healthy horses simultaneously. So I think that's kind of really where things like have to start. At the end of the day, we want our horses to be set up successfully, like right from the beginning, right? And then, of course, nutrition plays a huge role, not only while these horses are developing, but throughout their entire life. And then with that, I think it kind of ties into maybe my third point, but we really need to like support that healthy development. So I'm sure that Dr. Nielsen will bring this up soon, if not immediately. But it's really important that our young horses have access to exercise. We were talking about this in his seminar course recently even, but like just even allowing like really healthy play can be incredibly important in predisposing that musculoskeletal system to be able to withstand the physical challenges of that horse's life. We don't want to really restrict that movement because especially while they're growing, that's when we're conveying all that really important information to our mechanosensitive tissues like our bone and our cartilage, letting them know that, hey, you have a job, we're going to ask you to do hard things, and they can more readily adapt to those forces while they're young. And that, again, kind of ties into the nutrition aspect as well. And then I think kind of when we get into the point where people maybe have a little bit more control, because again, I recognize that if you got your horse when it was 12 or 15, everything I just said might be a little bit outside of your window of control, right? But keeping our horses fit, I think, can be really helpful. We know that up to like 50% of horses, at least here in the United States, are overweight. And that just puts excess stress on their joints, right? So they're carrying around all that extra weight plus their rider. That's one way that we can reduce the strain we're putting on their joints just by keeping them in a healthy way. And then similarly, when I talk about being that with them being fit, kind of like we talked about earlier, it's important that our ligaments are healthy, our tendons are healthy, our muscles, all of those things that are going to help actually move the joint not only correctly, but provide it stability. So if your horse is going to be in work, it's important that you do that well. You don't want to take a horse that's out of shape and put them into a program like they, haven't seen a season off in the last 5 years, right? Because that's going to be asking a lot of them. And then along with fitness, to keep them fit, we need to really think about our healthy exercise, which is things that Dr. Nielsen just kind of alluded to. I know some of the things that you kind of had suggested in there with things like keeping the feet balanced, what type of footing you're using. I think all of that kind of plays into healthy exercise. And really when I talk about healthy exercise, it's mostly about ensuring that the horse is able to load correctly and we're not overdoing it. So we're asking enough of the horse that maybe we're pushing, maybe we'll see, some response to the exercise, right? Don't want it to be too light, otherwise they're not going to get stronger or fitter or anything like that. But you also don't want to go crazy where we're going to cause injuries if we're doing circular exercise, which a lot of people do. Even like, Dr. Logan talks about this a lot, that it needs to be with a purpose. We're not just putting a horse on a lunge line and watching it whip around in circles because we feel like we should be doing it. It needs to be intentional. And there's a lot of things that you can do with your footing, for instance. Like if you're working on circles a lot, make sure it's banked. Or if it's circles under saddle, you need to do it in a way that your horse can actually maintain themselves upright. You shouldn't feel like you're on like a motorcycle going around your corners, things like that. So really making sure that as we're working a horse through their fitness program to keep them in shape so that they have healthy movement, we want the exercise itself to actually be supporting those things. We don't want to just push them super hard in the name of like getting them fit without thinking of how those things tie together. So I think that's my 5. And then if I were to sum it all up for people who really they have their horses now, really just maintaining healthy movement, I think is really critical. And there's a lot of ways to do that. But just having the horse out and moving, that's going to help them recover from their exercise. Ideally, they're doing that in a pasture setting, and so they have pretty good nutrition with that. So I feel like I've been talking forever on my 5 points, but
I am.
I feel like it's cheating to be like, well, it's genetics and nutrition and exercise and but it is. It feels like it's a little bit of everything that we need to
Yeah.
consider. You
Yeah.
can't manage really systemic issues with only, from one single approach, right?
That's right. And I love to think about what we do with horses in terms of how they evolved, and they moved constantly. So movement is such a big thing. But another aha moment for me in our podcast where we talked about your research was that you described cartilage like a sponge, and that it has there's no blood running through cartilage. And correct me if I'm incorrect on any of this, but and that the movement is, it squashes the cartilage and sort of moves nutrients through it as the horse moves. And you made the point that for horses standing around doing very little in a stall, none of that is happening. So can you, on that basis, and add whatever you like to it, but talk a little bit more about why movement is so essential, and then we'll bring you into this too, Brian, just to cover the bone aspect of this, because that's an important piece of this puzzle as well.
Yeah. Well, honestly, I think you already kind of described it really well, but cartilage in and itself is an avascular tissue, so it doesn't have a direct blood supply, which is why it primarily relies on the synovial fluid that we talked about earlier for its nourishment. It can get some nutrients, like in our calcified layers from the subchondral bone, but that's not its primary way that it likes to get its nutrients. It's really through the synovial fluid. And so through that kind of like spongy motion when we're moving and we like compress the cartilage and then it kind of rebounds, that's how we're actually like pushing the synovial fluid into the tissue, and it kind of creates a pumping effect. So we can get the old fluid out, remove our waste, and get our like nutrients back in. And when a horse is, or even a person is sedentary, you can get some nutrients that are just going to diffuse kind of at that top layer of the cartilage. But then you have your deeper layers where that fluid's not really moving out, stuff can accumulate, like our waste products. And you can have these like hypometabolic regions where like you're asking the cartilage to deteriorate basically because you're essentially not feeding it by not moving. So it's really important that moving the joint creates that sponging effect, or like the imbibition of like is really kind of like describes the sponging, if you will. It's a perfect pump essentially. And I think people are very familiar with the idea of like getting their blood pumping right, or the concept of like, oh, you have an injury and like blood needs to flow to the area. So we're pretty well, most people I think can wrap their heads around like getting their blood moving so that way they're delivering nutrients that way. And it's really kind of the same idea with the cartilage and the synovial fluid, but here specifically, instead of just getting up and moving our body to get blood pumping, we need to really make sure the joint is moving and working to get the synovial fluid pumping, if you will, so that it actually can reach through the layers of the cartilage, get waste products out, and bring the nutrients back in.
So we'll get to you in a moment, Brian, but two questions. One is there any studies looking at stalled horses versus pastured horses and their joint health? And then the second question is, how many hours a day should horses be moving? Because, they feed for 16 to 18 hours a day. And when they were in the wild, before we domesticated them, that feeding was, take a step, eat some mouthfuls, take a step, eat some mouthfuls. So they were moving for 16 to 18 hours of the day as well. Is that what we should be aiming for? I mean, it's just interesting because we've changed their management so much from how they evolved, that do we know the impact of stalling horses?
Yeah, so I know, so one study that it like immediately comes to mind is typically when we're looking at growing horses. So horses essentially when they're born, their cartilage is all identical. But as an adult, within different regions of the joint, the composition of that cartilage looks a little different. And in comparing stalled foals to pasture raised foals, we saw that the ones on pasture had better like differentiation of that tissue, showing that the exercise was really helping the joint development. But following that study, the stalled foals were put back onto pasture, and it appeared that when in their follow-up, this was done at an age where they caught right back up to the pasture group. But I think that is a really good and kind of clear example that exercise really is critical in maintaining joint health when the cartilage itself, like its development depends on that movement essentially. So, I can't think of necessarily anything like more recently that's like strictly looking at like aged horses in comparison, which maybe Dr. Nielsen has something in mind in terms of specifically joint health or incidence of osteoarthritis in stalled versus pasture housed horses. But I don't know that I've come across like incidence of arthritis in that kind of setup. And then your second question about how many hours should horses be outside? I personally would say all of them. That's what I would love to see.
Mm.
And I don't know that we necessarily have a great number at like once you hit 10 hours, we don't see any differences between them and like pasture housed horses specifically. I know it seems like a lot of facilities are moving towards trying to have like a 10 to 12-hour split. And I think, that's still a lot of progress compared to just having morning or just having afternoon
Mm.
turnout,
Mhm.
where it was like 2 to 4 hours. So ideally, if your horse can be out all of the time, that would be phenomenal. But I think, aiming for at minimum half of the day, we're going to still be doing a lot better than we were.
Mm. And then, Brian, we know, I mean, your research shows really clearly the effect of stalling on bone strength. So can you, and it's episode 4, and we actually just re-released that episode because when we first did that, our following on this podcast was so tiny. I'm like, right, everyone needs to know this information. So it just went out again this week. So if anyone wants to listen to that, I think it was originally episode 4, and again now I think it was episode 50 we just released. So to listen in detail about the impact of exercise on bone health. But so as you stall horses, their bone strength goes down because they're not moving. But does that then have implications for, and I'll get you to explain that a little better than I just did, but does that then have implications for joints as well?
Before I answer the bone stuff, I want to throw out a little bit more stuff regarding joints and time outside and movement. Renee had mentioned the seminar class, and for the listeners, this is a animal or equine science seminar classes for senior level students in our department. Nerida was part of that, and Dr. Chris Rogers from Massey University in New Zealand, he came in and well, virtually. And he shared some interesting stats, and Renee might be able to help me remember it if I don't get it exactly right. But it
Right.
was looking at how much distance horses covered during the course of a day, depended upon how big of an area they had access to. So we love the idea of horses being turned out, but there's a big difference between a tiny little paddock, technically that's turned out, it's not stuck in a stall, versus a bigger paddock versus something that's actually really large. And I think when the area they were turned out into was large enough, I think the distance these horses would cover in a day was like 7 kilometers. Does that sound about right, Renee? And
It
she's like,
sounds like the ballpark.
well, we'll go ballpark. It's close enough to get an
Yeah.
idea. But if you had it in a relatively small paddock, they don't cover that much. But once it's a larger area, they begin to travel more throughout the course of the day, which probably has a lot of benefits. And the following at this point is purely anecdotal, but I think it's pretty intriguing and people stay tuned. In June of last year, when we were out at the Equine Science Seminar or Equine Science Symposium out in Colorado, we made a trip up to Wyoming where there is this ranch, 2,500 acres, where they take thoroughbred racehorses that a lot of them are pretty close to the end of people thinking they can do anything for them. A lot of lameness issues and with concerns that this horse might have to be put down. And they turn them loose on 2,500 acres. And again, this is anecdotal, and we were out there with the idea of trying to develop research studies, and the people managing this place are great, and I expect some really cool stuff coming out of there. But they said they've had some of these horses that basically are pretty close to healed. They've turned out, and without veterinary intervention by just movement.
Mm.
A lot of things, because we do stick these horses into stalls and we think that's fine because, well, that's how horses are kept, but it isn't fine.
Mhm.
And especially for joints. And I'll give some more anecdotal information. I'm always very leery about anecdotal, but I think this is something our listeners can, especially listeners who've gotten to like our age, my age, I am older, um, where you get up out of bed in the morning, and especially like days when I've been doing a lot of training, my training is much more wimpy these days. But if you saw me getting out of bed, it's like, wow, that's a crippled old man. I mean, it's walking very slowly. But by the time I've been up for a little bit, I'm fine. And actually, once I get to running, I'm great and all that stuff. It shows you how in mobility, immobility, lack of
Mhm.
mobility, words, they're hard. Um, if you don't move, you get really stiff.
Yeah.
That should be easy enough for people to understand. Or you take a long car ride and you get out and it's like, oh, I need to stretch. I need to move around. That's because you've had lack of mobility. You get
Mm.
out, move around a bit, you're fine.
Mhm.
So again, I'm always leery about anecdotal evidence, anecdotal stories, but folks, this is so clear if you think about it as to the importance of it. Now, let's
I
go back
think
to your
if I interrupt you before you move on to bone, I think
That's
just
fine.
from the perspective, I think, of the listener too, is like we have to recognize that sometimes like the space you have is limited, right? Like we can't necessarily, not everybody has multiple acres. The facility you're boarding at might not have that amount of space, but there's ways to encourage movement within that amount of space, right? Like instead of having one huge hay feeder right in the middle, you can have a couple smaller ones spread out around the space, separate the water from the feeder, or have a couple buckets, encourage them, even if it is in a smaller space, just to have kind of spread out those resources, especially if they're with other horses, they'll push each other away, move to the other one. We don't want to cause fighting, right? But there are some ways that if you're working with a limited space, because that's all you have, we get that. I'd rather them be outside in a small space than not outside at all. But you do have still some tools in your toolbox to use to kind of artificially, get their step count a little higher throughout the
Mm.
day.
Well, there was a really beautiful conversation I had with Dr. Catherine Goldberg, so episode 44 on the Happy Horse Nutrition podcast, and we talked about track systems, and for exactly this reason, getting them to move. So if anyone wants information on that, you can go there. And then another cool conversation I had was with Joanna, talking about horse depression and behavior and nutrition. But she says to people, take your horse for a walk like it's a dog. Go wandering in the forest and let it sniff things and explore things and just have that bit of behavior and freedom to choose where it's going. Because something I'd never thought of was that horses were in their stable. They never really get to choose what they want to do. But, when she's got time, she'll take her horse out just walking for a few hours and just let it wander around. So you can do that when you've only got a small area too, if you've got space to go and wander and just let your horse be a horse for a little while. Hey, quick pause. If you're trying to figure out what to feed your horse, you don't have to do it solo. The My Happy Horse app helps you make sense of nutrition clearly, calmly, and without overwhelm. It's like having me in your pocket when you need reassurance the most. Visit myhappy.horse or grab it from the App Store. Okay, let's get back into it.
And I am so glad that Renee mentioned that, because I don't want to have anybody feel bad that they don't have. I only have 10 acres. I would love to have more. I don't have as much as would be ideal, but you make do with what you have and you try to make the right decisions. But a lot of times people make the decisions without the knowledge as to what might be useful. Again, there are so many people that are still believing stalling is the best for the horse because they perceive it as, well, they're protected from the elements and they don't get sun bleached, and I can go on. And they get this nice, soft bed to sleep on, deep bedding, which there is merit in a lot of this stuff. But this idea of trying to think of ways to encourage your horse to move, and let's have the right type of movement. So remind me to get back to the right type of movements, but I actually have to talk about another study we did where we saw a very unique result. We had like basically it would have been fitness trackers on horses, their legs. So we could kind of like advanced pedometers and trying to figure out whether their movement was related to weather. We figure, well, when it gets cold, they might run around more than when it's really hot. One of the most interesting results from that study is we had horses at my place versus horses like 3 miles away. So very similar weather. 3 miles, it's going to be the same.
Mm.
But it was a different group of horses. Most of my horses are retired race horses. At the other facility, show horses. The one horse that was not a retired racehorse was a 33-year-old of some type of make-believe breed. She was cute. She's basically a big pony. And the amazing thing is she covered way more distance than did any of the other horses at this other farm. And it was because she was housed with retired racehorses who are bred to run. And so when they go running, old Sheila, she'd be like, I'm coming, I'm coming, I'm coming. It was adorable watching her try and keep up. But it made sense why she actually covered a lot of distance because of the horses she was housed with were ones that were more inclined to. So if you have couch potato horses and they're housed with other couch potato horses, they might not move around. So even when we give them access to exercise, they might not take it up. So as we begin to compile all these things, there are lots of things that go into trying to keep healthy joints. And even sometimes we think we're being good by having partial turnout. And in fact, when we talk bone, which we'll get to very soon, you don't need a lot of turnout to make bone strong. But let's step back for a bit. There are studies that show with particularly young horses, we might see more problems with partial turnout given certain circumstances versus being turned out all the time. And a lot of it is when you go ahead and you turn this young horse out, it's going to run. That's good. The problem is let's say you have a very small paddock, it's going to run and then it needs to come to a very quick stop or a very sharp turn. And that's where we might be causing some more problems. So it's the right type of exercise, ones where we don't do insult to the joints. And I had a friend from years ago, back when I was in Texas, this lady, a former jockey, and she moved into academia, wonderful individual. And she had been following our research, talking about the importance of exercise. And I remember encountering her at a research meeting, and she was like, here's the problem. I've heard what you've been saying about that, but suddenly we're having all kinds of joint problems. Well, it turns out she'd put him on a high-speed walker to exercise him. So it's circular exercise. And I'll say, okay, that's the problem. Anything where we're doing uneven loading of the joint surface runs the risk of creating problems. So the right type of exercise is so critical. And circular or angular exercise, it tends to cause problems. Not saying you can't have any of it. Let's face reality. Most of the times when you're riding a horse, you're going to have to turn. We don't all do endurance riding. And so just knowing how to, or recognizing that if we do too much of it, we're going to cause some problems. I actually had pretty much no lameness issues in myself until training for a marathon over the winter, running on an indoor track, which is 1/8 of a mile. And I should have known better, but on some of my workouts there was like 100 and basically about 120 different laps per training cycle. And I've caused permanent injuries to myself where now I actually have to be careful because if I do too much, it now has an issue. I should have known better, but we make some mistakes. We don't think about it. And then you realize afterwards, it was like, yes, all that circular exercise. So now let's talk about bone because you asked a question about it. The amazing thing about bone is how little. Well, I'm going to step. When we talk about bone, we talk about strides or we talk about loading and cycles. Every stride would be a cycle, one bending of the bone. Bone likes to bend. It has what we refer to as an optimal strain environment. It wants to bend a little, but not too much. If bone bends too much, it says, oh, we aren't strong enough. We need to become stronger, and it becomes stronger. If bone doesn't bend enough, bone says, oh, we're too strong. We don't need to carry this extra mineral along. Let's get rid of some of that, and it becomes weaker. When we put a horse in a stall and we do not allow it to run at all, the bone doesn't bend. Think of the cannon bone, the third metacarpal bone. It doesn't bend very much. And the body says, we don't need to carry around this extra mineral. Evolutionary wise, that makes sense because in order to survive, you need to outrun something that's going to eat you.
Hmm.
If you're trying to eat something else, you need to outrun that thing that you're trying to eat. So you want to be as efficient as possible, and carrying around extra weight in your legs is a really bad idea. So if you're not using it, let's get rid of that extra mineral, and it becomes weaker. The problem is, think of a racehorse, a jumper, anything that's putting a lot of force on the legs. If you allowed that bone to become weaker and now you start to load it and don't give it enough time to actually become stronger, that's where we have some problems. This, of course, is not applicable to all horses. A dressage horse rarely breaks its leg.
Mm.
And so, that's where we have problems with the arthritis because of the circles that we do or things like that. But effectively, we've done the research here where as little as 1 sprint per week, going a distance of about 70 meters over a 6-week period, so a month and a half, 70-meter sprint once per week, made it about a 26% difference in bone breaking strength of the cannon bone. That would be the similar if you total up all of those sprints over a 6 weeks period. If you went to your typical track like at the Olympics, a 400-meter thing, that's a little bit more than once around that track over a month and a half.
Mm.
It doesn't take much. By contrast, we've done studies with simulated endurance training where horses are training hundreds of miles or hundreds of kilometers, and there is no improvement in bone strength compared to ones that weren't in training but are also allowed to be out on pasture. So it's not the distance that you travel at speed, it's needing some strides taken at speed, but it doesn't take much. I will often pull my students and it's like, okay, if you have a young athletic horse, how long does it need to be turned out in order to have, strong enough bones? And they're like guessing, well, maybe a few hours, maybe 10 hours, 12 hours. And the answer I give them is probably 10 seconds is enough. Because when you turn this young athletic horse out that you've been cooping up in a stall, it's going to run and it's going to cover that distance. So that might satisfy bone. That's not going to satisfy the joint health.
So,
And so we
what?
always have to
Sorry,
combine
Brian.
it all. Go ahead.
So yeah, so they're all. I mean, they're all connected. Like the bone is sitting underneath the cartilage. So if we're leaving a horse in a stall and its bones start to do the evolutionary smart thing of going, okay, I don't need all of this mineral. I'll demineralize a little bit to lighten my skeleton. What does that then do to the joint surface? Because you've got weaker bone. Like, is there implications then for the joint itself when you've got that weaker bone sitting underneath the cartilage?
I would have to believe it does.
Mm.
The problem with this type of research is there's not many of us in this world that are doing this type of stuff. And you can only answer one question at a time often, and it takes a lot of funding.
Mm.
So I'm certain it does. Because again, if you have not been stimulating that bone, and that's that foundation under the cartilage, it makes sense that you have this weakened surface.
Mm.
I'll turn it over to Renee because she's actually probably studying the literature on this stuff way more than I am right now, and she may have some more
Yeah.
thoughts on it. But I
Yeah.
also believe
Well,
this is the next researcher that's going to be answering all those questions. So
yeah, but big shoes. We definitely know that like maintaining healthy subchondral bone is important for maintaining our joint health overall. I don't know that I have come across like the combination of like speed work, bone strength, subchondral bone to the joint to like
Mm.
put all of those pieces together. So, yes, we do know that having healthy bone can is, is necessary for also having a healthy joint as well. So I would have to agree that in terms of the subchondral bone, by keeping the bone satisfied with its workload essentially, that is going to help support the joint because it is providing it that nice kind of like foundation. There is also some some literature that suggests that like when the horses are sedentary, the actual like surface of their cartilage can change not anything that you would necessarily like visually see, but kind of like the micro architecture of the surface. And it's kind of like a very similar concept as to like what bone does, in a way that it's like, well, you're not using me, so I'm going to kind of like lose these qualities. So it's interesting to see that they're both mechanosensitive, right? They need that stimulus in order for them to keep up with what we ask of them. And now I'm like personifying the tissues, but that's fine. But I think we're in a place where we know I think we know a lot more about the bone right now from that like loading perspective and exactly how we get it to like react the way we want it to than we do with cartilage so far. But I think yeah, like the moral of the story is like, yes, I need my subchondral bone to be strong, right? Because then if I get a fracture at the end of like a long bone, for instance, or what have you, and I've disrupted the articular and like the subchondral bone, that's a good example of like where you need that subchondral bone support, because our calcified cartilage and that subchondral bone are really like what keeps it anchored. So if I have anything that disrupts that bone in that area, it's too weak, it fractures. I've also, in turn, damaged that cartilage because they're intricately connected.
Mm. So the movement
So,
piece.
Nerida,
Sorry.
before we go on, one thing that I'm actually happy that I see evolving, like in the veterinary field,
Mhm.
is, in the 90s, 80s, whatever, you hear about a horse needing to be on stall rest. And I think we're migrating away from that, and I think that's a very good thing. Now, first of all, there are times when stall rest makes absolute sense. You have a broken leg?
Mm.
Probably don't need to be out running around. But also, when you put a horse in the stall and you have this lack of mobility because we are restraining it, everything Renee just talked about becomes an issue. One, we're not stimulating the bone, so it's going to get weaker.
Mhm.
We're not stimulating the cartilage, so it's probably going to get weaker. And then once we finally return the horse to training, we are now way set back from where that horse was. Whereas if we allow that horse to go ahead and horses to some degree have a little bit of ability to say, oh, this is hurting me, I'm not going to do it. No, they sometimes will run around a bit, but most of the time they're probably not going to damage themselves as long as we allow them to be out there and are used to it. It's when we stick them in a stall for long periods of time and then we turn them loose, then they often will do really silly things.
Mm.
But again, I'm glad that people are beginning to catch on to the idea that realistically, moving around is not a bad thing. In fact, it's
Mm-mm.
kind of necessary.
And it just cements for me even more that, horses have been on this earth for 55 million years, and we have been in their life for 0.01% of that time. And I like to say it the other way around, that 99.99% of their time on earth, we have had nothing to do with them. So we can't, and certainly this is the case with their gastrointestinal physiology and nutrition. If we take them away from feeding the way that they evolved to feed, we cause massive problems. But this is sounding exactly the same thing. We take them away from their natural movement patterns and we weaken their bone and we stop feeding their cartilage, and we cause both bone health issues and joint issues. This is what yeah. And then for exercise, they're both nodding at me, which is good. I'm taking that as agreement. And then exercise, there's two parts here. So the speed that we need to maintain the bone strength that we need for them to do whatever athletic endeavor we're asking of them, and then this more constant movement, Renee, of that's compressing and releasing the cartilage so that they're feeding their joint surfaces, and this is what they did in the wild, right? They got chased by things, or they just wanted to go for a run and they'd sprint for a little while, but the rest of the time they were just moving around feeding all the time.
Yeah.
Yes.
The classic case of humans stuffing things up again. And I mean,
And we do it thinking we're brilliant. Yeah.
And you can understand, from back when horses were pulling all of our transportation and stuff, like we needed to keep them close by so that we could get them and they were handy. But I see this definitely in nutrition. There's so many people are now realizing that we can't ride our horses on empty stomachs. We can't leave them without hay for any period of time. We're realizing now that the way we used to do things is not the way we necessarily should be doing things. Not with everything, but with a lot of ways we've managed horses in the past. We're starting to realize that that probably wasn't the best thing.
And I also understand people wanting to protect their horse that's extremely valuable.
Mm.
I am not lucky enough to own horses worth hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
And it might change my perspective, not my knowledge, but my perspective, if I had a horse that was worth millions of dollars. Because I would be very scared of that horse getting hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have a very valuable animal that you're worried about getting scared, we want to protect them. It's kind of like as a parent, we want to protect our kids. And in doing so, sometimes we do what's worse for them. We be that helicopter parent that just is like, I want to protect you. I don't want to expose you to any bad things at all. And that's maybe not the best thing for our kids. Sometimes getting exposed to the real world, by the way, the real world can also be a horrible place. So I'm not saying, you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah. I mean, they need to learn to
yeah.
take responsible risks so that they don't go and take stupid risks. And it is a really good analogy because bone needs to be told what type of stress is going to be put on it so that when it experiences that stress, it's strong enough to cope with it. It's
Yes,
a good analogy. So I want to move to nutrition now because what I see and have seen time and time again in my career as a nutritionist is that all of this joint health stuff starts in utero. So, and therefore there is a lot that maybe we can't influence with a horse's joint health because a lot of what has happened to that horse has happened, if you buy a 15-year-old horse, that pregnancy was 16 years ago and there's not a lot that you can go back and do to change that. And I see, and I just recorded a podcast about weanlings yesterday, like I've worked with farms over the years where they would have a 50% or more incidence of OCD in their young horses, and it was purely because nutrition was not right. Their pasture was throwing a curveball at them, or they're feeding too much and having these horses grow too quickly, or there was some kind of mineral imbalance or deficiency. So I think I just want to throw that in there as part of this conversation is that a horse's lifetime nutrition is so important. So was the mare supplemented properly? Was the weanling fed? Did it have its calcium, phosphorus, magnesium requirements all met? Were they in balanced ratios? Was copper, zinc, and manganese all in there? So it's really important when they're young, but then also as adults, it stays important because there's joints. I've got joints on the brain. There's nutrients that are really important for joint health that are frequently deficient in horse diets.
Yeah, I'll actually start with this one from the standpoint of, if you go back even to the 80s, there's some pretty good evidence that showed like low copper. If you had low copper in your diet, you're going to have some joint problems.
Yeah.
And fortunately, a lot of people have caught on to that, and the commercial feed industry has definitely embraced that, and that's why they go ahead and will have added copper to a lot of the diets that would be fed to either growing horses or the brood mares. And we've done a lot of research here at Michigan State where we have to send off hay samples to get analyzed, and a lot of these, they don't, it might look like beautiful hay. It's green, it's leafy, it's delicious, high protein, everything else. But then you look at the micronutrients, it's like, ooh, we have some issues. And if we were feeding this to a pregnant broodmare, it will increase the likelihood that her baby's going to have some cartilage issues, or if we're feeding it to that growing horse. And I often think, the mature horse that's doing nothing, pasture pet, you may escape having problems. Our growing horses, you try and do this, and you're really going to increase the likelihood of having problems. And so
And
I
I would push back on you on the sedentary horse too, because I see the copper. It's not uncommon to see copper in forages all around the world. It's not just. I mean, I've looked at thousands of them here in Australia, but I've looked at a lot of forage samples from other parts of the world too. Japan is a really good example because I see lots of pasture from up there. And it's not uncommon to see copper at 4 parts per million, where the minimum requirement is 10, right? So we get zincs as low as 9 parts per million, and the minimum requirement is 40. So I think even for those sedentary horses over a long period of time, you will start to see problems. And the cool thing, well, cool, not cool, but you'll see that in their hooves, like, because the hoof is on the outside of the body, right? We can't
Sure.
see into the joint. I'm sure if we could see into the joint, we may be a little bit horrified at what we see as well. But I've got this cool photo on my phone of a horse that I rode in Wyoming in the States in 2019. And she was a beautiful Palomino quarter horse, and they were all just maintained on hay. Well, her hooves were just trying to fall off the rest of her body. Like, they were so cracked and brittle. And those horses were not they were on a beautiful diet from the perspective that they were on lots of forage, but they weren't supplemented with anything, and you could see that. So I can only imagine that what we see on the outside with their hooves is also potentially going on inside with their joints.
And the way you describe that horse is perfect for another thing that we need to talk about, which is, um, people look at a horse and they see its fleshy, its body condition score 5, 6, 7,
Mhm.
and they're like, wow, it's obviously getting enough feed. We don't need to provide it anymore.
Yeah.
No, what it's getting is plenty of calories. We don't need to feed it more calories, but that doesn't indicate at all if it's meeting its nutritional requirements.
Mm.
Yes, you're getting it for calories, and even for our growing horses, I've seen this so many times. The horses are, the weanlings, yearlings, they're chubby, and they're like, well, we need to cut its feed down. No, you might need to reevaluate what you're feeding it, because oftentimes it is not meeting its micronutrient
Mm.
requirements, or even the protein, depending what it's being fed. And I always love to use my son as a comparison. I am not the world's tallest person. I looked into it. I'm not even the world's second tallest person. I'm 5'6". My son is 6'5". And the thing is never did I actually ever consider limit feeding him. Oftentimes people are like, oh, they're growing fast, we need to limit how much we feed them. No. But the next part is my son eats unbelievably healthy. I am not my son. But the deal is you can grow fast and you can grow tall and big. And for our horses, we often like that. But are you feeding them the right balanced diet? And, Dr. Gary Potter, a great equine nutritionist, was my major professor, and he always talked about the nutrient to calorie ratio. So are you taking in enough nutrients, meaning the minerals, the protein, the amino acids, relative to the calories? Because if you're taking in empty calories, and think of humans, people who do nothing but drink soda pop or eat candy or whatever, that's probably not the good way to develop a good foundation for your growth.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yep. It's something we have. I'm sure we've talked about this, but Dr. Potter was one of my PhD examiners.
Oh, I did not know that.
Did you not?
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
Was it intimidating?
Well, no, because it's very different in, like, we submit our Australian PhDs and it gets examined, and then it comes back. And he actually, I also had a German examiner, and she failed me, but also hadn't read my PhD. And Dr. Potter had written, this is the best piece of work I've seen on this subject. So I had like two really, and then my other two examiners had to go and bat for me with the German one and got her one overturned. But anyway, it's a long story, and I'll tell you another time. But you're right. Like, and I think when I first started as a nutritionist, what I used to see was that a lot of breeding farms would feed their young horses oats. So they would add the calories in, but they wouldn't necessarily be feeding a balancer pellet, which also brought in all the nutrients they needed to support the bone at the rate they were making it grow. So if you don't, I envisage it like, and I don't even think I've ever been in an egg packing factory, so I don't know where I get this image from, but I imagine in an egg packing factory, they would have all the egg cartons and then the eggs being put in to all the little spots, right? If you run that conveyor belt at the same pace that you're dropping the eggs down, then you're filling all the spots, and every egg carton will have an egg in all of the spots. So that, to me, is a horse not being fed too much energy or not being supplemented with energy, and everything's kind of happening at the pace that it should happen. But if you then go and drop oats into a horse's diet and make it grow faster, it's kind of like speeding up that conveyor belt without speeding up the rate that you're putting the eggs in, and then you're leaving holes. So you get bone that is not calcified properly or not mineralized properly because that you haven't added in those extra nutrients. So what we always do with young horses is try to match, and sometimes we do have to restrict feed them or not, at least not go and pour a whole lot of energy into their diet so they're not growing too quickly. But we need to make sure that we're bringing in calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, and all of the trace minerals to make sure that we're matching nutrient supply to exactly what Dr. Potter's saying, matching the nutrient supply to the calorie supply. And it's so, and it just with what you were saying before, Brian, when people look at horses and go, they're in really good condition, so I don't need to feed them anything. This is why I get so passionate about what I've done for the last 20-something years in building software for people so that they can actually visualize their horse's diet. Because unless you can see what that horse is missing, you don't actually realize that you've got problems that you need to go in and fix. And if those problems stay there, so, copper, zinc, selenium, and iodine in Australia, if a horse is just on forage, I will say to people, I will bet everything I know that your horse will be deficient in at least one, if not all four of these nutrients if you're not supplementing them, because they're just not in our soils, they're not in our forages. Well, they are in our soils for copper and zinc, but they don't necessarily end up in the forage. And selenium and iodine, we just don't have very much of in this country at all. But if they don't see that and that horse goes for a really long period of time without having that supplementation, that's, I think, when we start getting these disastrous joint issues in the teenage years, because we've had essentially white ants eating away at our house and we haven't noticed it. And then all of a sudden the house falls down because it's been so eaten away behind the walls where you haven't been able to see. So it's, that's big part of why I do what I do, is like bringing that stuff out so that you can see it and actually do something about it.
And I'm always amazed at how people decide what supplements or feeds and stuff they want to give their horse. Because in reality, the only nutrient you can determine whether, or only requirement you can look at your horse and know whether it's meeting or exceeding it, is energy. Everything else is math. I mean, you really need to know what's going in and what the requirements are. It is math. And unless you've done the math, and most of those horse owners haven't done the math, they're often what the advertisements say.
And the problem with that is that we get horse owners, we get confused, we get worried, and then we go and over supplement, which costs us a fortune.
Right.
So when you've got that certainty of knowing, which is, anyway, it is, you're right, it's maths, but when you try to calculate 25 different nutrients at one time, it's really, really hard to do that math. Which is why we build software
programs out there to do that.
So, Renee, this can be going on in the background, like white ants eating away at a house, and we don't necessarily know it's there. What are some of the early signs that a horse's joints may not be coping, like ones before you get to, oh, my horse feels sore or looks lame or whatever? Is there anything else that we can use to sort of determine whether the horse is heading in that direction?
Yeah, I think Dr. Nielsen talked about it earlier, but I feel that usually one of the first things people notice is that their horse is stiff. Right? So like maybe it's not truly lame, but especially when it's a stiffness that they warm up out of. Yes, maybe they're, stalled overnight, you pull them out first thing in the morning, but like we've discussed, if they're always stalled for a good portion of their day, like that's probably contributing to some of that joint stiffness anyway, which isn't great for it. So I would definitely say like stiffness tends to be kind of one of those big things, especially if they can still work out of it, because if they're working out of it, it suggests that, we're not completely lost yet, right? But even just more subtle things like if you're starting to notice like uneven wear on their feet, there could be like some compensation going on that maybe you can see evidence of, but you're not picking up on directly when you're just watching the horse, but it's showing itself over time. Or if you have a horse that can't really reach under themselves, like they're just not moving right, but you wouldn't quite call them lame yet. I think those are kind of important things. I think too, just like kind of like just more like difficulty getting around than they used to. Maybe, they go and roll and it's like, well, it took you a little longer to get up than I feel like it should have, like those kinds of things. And then, or also, maybe after like kind of a more strenuous workout, it's taking them like longer to recover than usual. It's normal to have inflammation after exercise. That's kind of common, but it shouldn't last. It shouldn't last very long. But if you have this kind of like lingering soreness, lingering inflammation, it can tell that maybe you're either pushing too hard or you have an underlying issue that's there that maybe you weren't necessarily aware of. And then the same thing is like if your horse is having a change in behavior, right? Like they're now becoming unwilling, they're like not super happy that you're asking them to move a certain way. They can't seem to keep up with the things that they used to keep up with. Especially, I think, sometimes you have horses that are like a little bratty or naughty, and like that's fine. But if that's not normal for that horse, I think it's important to take that into consideration. Because I think most of the time horses are pretty willing to tell you that they're uncomfortable
Mm.
before you might be able to see it for yourself. And I think it's just kind of our responsibility to have good horsemanship and listen to that.
Mm.
When you have a change, your, saintly pony is probably didn't just like wake up on the wrong side of the bed that morning.
Mm.
That's not really something that they do. And then, of course, if you're noticing that like the joint itself is swollen or you can't get the swelling to go away, that can let you know that either an injury has occurred or you push too hard, those types of things. But that's a little bit more of the acute side, but I feel like the general stiffness tends to usually be where it starts, where like he doesn't feel as good on a circle this way, or he's not reaching up under himself anymore, before you would necessarily say like the horse is lame.
Mm. Mhm. It's interesting, isn't it? The behaviour change is this what I see. So we have lots of high oxalate grasses in Australia, so we see a lot of big head disease, and one of the really early symptoms of that is that they just get grouchy. They don't want to be
Okay.
touched.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily want to do anything. They don't want you to be near them. They're just grumpy.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I see that and horses are on those pastures, I'm like, that horse is in trouble. We need to do something really quick. So yeah, it's lots of sort of more subtle things, and like you said, if we're listening to our horse, and they're very happy to tell us that something's not right. It's a matter of taking that as information as opposed to something the behavior that we need to fix, which is what Joanna talks about a lot in the podcast with her. So I'm conscious of the time. I seem to be able to talk to you guys for long periods of time. So I guess I want to take people from feeling like, oh, it's just this, this is going to be an inevitable thing that happens to our horse, and joint disease is something that, is coming from a horse, regardless of what I do. There are things we can do. So if you could leave horse owners with the most practical, the most important feeding and management priorities, what would they be? What would your top 3 recommendations be?
Do you want to go first or do you want me to go first?
Oh, you go for it. Yes.
Okay. I
You're
would
doing
say
great today. I don't even need to be here. So,
I would say one of the easiest things that's probably most in your control is really the like dietary aspect, right?
Mhm.
And maybe you're boarding at a place and they only offer you like 3 types of feed, you know. Nobody should be stopping you from making sure your horse's diet is balanced, right? So if you I would is send you out on your mission to make sure your horse is being fed the way it needs to be fed, even if that is not traditionally overseen directly by you, right? We want to make sure that we're taking the initiative to make sure that they're getting really proper care in that area. And with that, we want to kind of make sure our horses are not overweight or obese, right? So that's one of like probably the easiest things, easy, right? But easiest things to control. And then I would say, regardless of your horse's age, try and make sure that they're getting really quality movement. And I think you brought up actually a really cool point earlier. If you are like, you have spatial limitations or wherever you're keeping horses is limiting turnout time, taking your horse for a walk, I think that's such a cool idea. Just getting them out, it doesn't necessarily need to be hard. And if you are concerned that your horse is not going to hand walk nicely, I'm sure that getting out and doing that is going to be a great way to improve on that skill, right? And we both work through some challenges together. So I think that's like another really nice thing that you can definitely have some control over. And then I think kind of going back to sort of a little outside of some people's control, especially if you got that horse like later in its life, right? But I think we really need to focus on what we do with these horses when they're young, so that way when they're older, they have a higher chance of success, right? We really need to get them that strong foundation because I think a lot of times with joint issues, right, we think of arthritis as we get older, and that's kind of some of the realities of it. But I think if you wait for later to happen, it's already too late,
Mm-hmm.
right? So by the time you realize that, like, oh, like now it is later and I have this joint problem and now I need to address it, I think you've kind of like missed your target. The ship's probably already sailed.
Yeah.
So, which I know is kind of disheartening to hear. It's easy for us to sit here and tell you all the things that don't work, right? And today we don't necessarily have a solution yet. Like once the joint has deteriorated, it's kind of deteriorated. We don't have a whole way to cut back from that. But yeah, really controlling diet, controlling movement, those are things that I think everybody has the capabilities to implement into their horse's routine that they can have control over. So I think those are really helpful tools to use. And then if you are somebody who's working with young horses or you're breeding your own horses, what have you, put a lot of emphasis on how those horses are managed and the types of things that they're doing while they're still young and developing.
Yeah, that's all brilliant. Thank you, Renee. And I think to give people hope that not all is lost, and it's a little bit like the white ants have eaten your house, and your house is gone. But
Yeah.
we have an old horse. I mean, she's N=1, right? But we
Yeah.
got her. She was in her mid-30s. We don't actually know how old she was. A vet told us that she would last about 6 months because her joints were so bad that he was just sure that one of the ligaments or tendons or something was going to go. That was nearly 5 years ago. And she's been living, and she lives with an off the track. So she's out with a lay, and she's in a 30-acre paddock, and the lay moves a lot because she's an ex-racehorse. And so Breezy follows her around, and she'll still get a bit of a trot and a bit of a canter every now and again. And her hocks have gone from being these giant, swollen, like awful looking things down to there's still puffiness there. But I look at them now and go, they're so much better than what they were when you first came to us. So, and that's just all we've done. She's not had any medical intervention. I don't use any anti-inflammatories on her. It's just diet and exercise.
Motion is lotion, as they say.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I mean, she's never going to go back to having good joints, obviously, but they're better than
Right.
what they were. Yeah.
Yep.
So, yeah. Brian, did you have anything to add to Renee's brilliant diet, movement, and looking after them when
I
they're
thought
young?
Renee's answer was absolutely brilliant. The only thing I would even comment on is she mentioned about, keeping the weight off. And then I don't recall exactly what she said, but it was something to the effect of,
Yeah.
that is challenging. And it wasn't until probably like 20 years ago or so that I really discovered grazing muscles. And, I'll have to, if you're having trouble keeping your weight off your horse, and where we live here in Michigan, we get these summers, my grass is starting to grow. I have hay in my hay feeders. My horses are ignoring that because there's lush green grass out there. And it all started when I had a really fat donkey. And I knew that wasn't good for him, but I could not bear it to actually dry lot him and keep him away from the other horses and things like that. I was like, that would actually be, in my opinion, cruel to him. And so that's when I started to embrace this idea of a grazing muzzle, and actually kept him at a still chubby, but not dangerous weight. And then even with my racehorses live out on pasture. I'm probably one of the few people who has racehorses that will occasionally wear grazing muzzles. But being chubby as a racehorse is not a good thing. But I also did not want to stall him. So how do you manage trying to have your horse out where it's grazing and not be taking in too much? And that was an option. So I just want to throw that in as something I learned along the way to help with that, because none of us want to, well, I shouldn't say none of us, but most of us, we don't want to have to dry lot our animal and restrict her, because we know that's not good also from the behavior standpoint,
Yep.
from the gastric environment thing. So we figure out ways to do it.
And I'm also a fan of grazing muzzles and track systems and strip grazing as well, which is what I've preferred to use just because it's easier for me. And I had one of my horses was so intent on grazing through her muzzle that she was actually wearing her front teeth away on
Wow.
the muzzle, like almost down to the soft squishy bit that you don't want to get into. But yeah, so there's it's all horses for courses. You just work out what works for your property, for your animals, for your lifestyle, but you figure out ways of keeping them moving. And it's, yeah, thank you for bringing the weight thing up, because that's a big one when you don't have to carry that extra, couple of 100 pounds around that you might have if you're really overweight. It has a big impact.
We see this issue with humans too. Just calling it like it is.
Yeah,
With joint problems,
absolutely.
especially as our society gets older and you're putting on more weight.
Yeah.
It's like if you can keep that weight off, it's going to help you also. So the lessons kind of go hand in hand with horses and sometimes.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. And then for our clear, can't speak anymore, for our clear round quick questions with no refusals, are you willing to take part in a shortened version of this? Because we've already asked you some of your questions in previous podcasts. So for both of you, what is one myth about joint health you would love to banish forever?
can I take it first?
Yep.
That corticosteroids help heal joints. And I'm probably stealing Renee's. That's why I wanted to go first.
Yeah.
And I'm going to stop and let Renee continue on with this.
All right, yeah. You took a little bit of mine. I was going to say that managing symptoms is not the same as treating the disease. So we do want to manage those symptoms, but if we know our horse has joint disease, they're arthritic, what have you, I would encourage that you think critically about the things you're asking your horse to do. And if we know that we're just treating the pain, addressing the inflammation, right? Are we doing what's most fun for us, or are we doing what's best for the horse, right? So I would always just keep that in the back of your mind. But since he kind of took mine with the steroid injections, I also wanted to remind people that, and it's maybe not so much a myth, but kind of just like a notion that we all get, but like the deteriorating joint health is not an inevitable. And I think we really like hammered that home today, but like there are things that you can do. You don't just have to, dread the passing of time, right?
And I have a 23-year-old quarter horse in my paddock that is an excellent representation of that. Like he still floats in his canter like he was, an 8-year-old. He's beautiful. And he wouldn't do that if he was sore. They just don't feel like that. I want to add something in here. It's a sad story, but I think it's an important one on your point of managing the pain. As Tamaya was cross-country jump judging a few weeks ago, and a horse like really tragically jumped a jump and shattered both of its front fetlocks and had to be euthanized on the spot. And she was like right there. And she didn't see it happen, but she could see like everything going on with the horse being euthanized and that stuff. And so and I wasn't there. She's called me. She's absolutely bawling her eyes out in tears and really, really upset. And then she's saying, Mum, I never want to jump a lay at those heights. And like, I don't want anything to happen to her. So she was sort of thinking like, this can just happen to any horse. And if I jump too high, then I'm going to smash my horse's fetlocks. And I said to her, sweetie, you don't know what the story behind that horse is, and there's every chance that something was already going on in those joints, and I'm not saying that this was the case, and these tragic accidents happen, right? So it's not, but I had to say something to my 16-year-old to put her mind at ease, and I said to her, we don't know if that horse was sore and then they've medicated it so that it can't feel the joints and they were still able to come and do the event, and then disaster has struck because we've hidden the pain. And you talk about this a lot, Brian, as if you hide the pain, the horse doesn't know that it's in pain and it doesn't know that it should be protecting those joints. But yeah, it's just, every now and again you see these things happen in the horse industry, and I would love to know, I'd love to know the backstory of that horse to see if it was something that we could have done. I mean, it's too late for that horse, but it's not too late for all the other ones following it. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because it is a really important one. Is don't hide the pain, because you may end up with a disaster.
So just a little bit more on this. The use of corticosteroids commonly used, and again, it really gets rid of the pain and the inflammation that serves that purpose, but you can't expect that joint to be healed in a day or two. And often that's how quickly we see those differences. I've looked into a number of the like nationally televised catastrophic injuries that we've seen with racing here in the States. And virtually every one of those horses had been injected with corticosteroids
Yeah,
within a
wow.
few weeks of that happening, which it doesn't mean if you inject with corticosteroids, they're going to break down. But man, it increases the likelihood if the horse doesn't know there's that problem.
Mm.
And I want your listeners to stay tuned because there's a really good chance Renee will have another amazing paper that will come out with her work looking at that issue. But we'll have to keep that one under our hats for right now. And yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, we look forward to that, Renee, if and when
Yeah.
it happens. Okay, so next question, a happier one. What is one of your favorite horse memories? And it can be absolutely anything at all.
Renee, I'll let you go first since we're not going to use the same one because
Right. Yeah. One of the things that I came up with that I think I always look back on and really enjoy, the ranch I used to work at, we always had to start the summer with a horsemanship clinic, which was really like get on the new horses that we don't know what they're gonna do, right? So, we got to have, 3 or 4 days like straight of that. And it was just at the start of every summer, I got to like leave finals behind me and then spend 4 days on just trying 12 different horses. And there was a lot of times where, there's not enough horses for all of the staff. And then one horse is like really putting up a fight with somebody, and then you would get called in off the fence, and it was like a yes, me and coach. So those would always be like the best 4 days of the start of my summers. So that's always something, not one specific memory, but I really miss having that. So
Beautiful. What about you, Brian?
it's interesting. So many horses, so many stories. And I was like, how do I narrow it down? And then I decided I'll do this one. I'm holding up a picture for Nerida and Renee. And the
So
story deals with
it's
this
the
horse.
Thoroughbred. It's a Thoroughbred Journal magazine cover.
Yep,
with
it's a
it.
Minnesota Thoroughbred Journal, May 1989.
Well,
So it was a picture of Willie Shoemaker riding the horse Dakota Slew, and he's going against Julie Crone, who's riding a horse by the name of Don't Fool With Me. At that time, they were the all-time leading male jockey and all-time leading female jockey. And it was called The Duel at the Downs. In fact, in the back of my audience, there's a T-shirt. I have it framed, which highlighted that race. And the funny part is I had just gotten into horses like a year or two before 1986. This was 1989. And, but I had just started galloping or hadn't even started galloping racehorses. And we do a visit to this farm and it's like, oh my gosh, there's Dakota Slew. We're all heard about this horse. He was an amazing racehorse. I didn't realize I'm going to be riding this horse.
oh wow.
And the fun part about this story is the first time taking him on the track, the trainer is coming out there on the pony horse with me, and we start to gallop along, and all of a sudden that trainer stops his horse and takes off in the opposite direction. I'm thinking, I don't know why you're doing this, but whatever. Then when we meet up on the other side, he joined in. I was like, why did you do that? He goes, well, I realized if this horse took off with you, there is no way my pony horse is going to catch it. So I figured I'll go the other way. So anyway, it was just a fun little thing, but it was such a fun little moment for me. My first really great racehorse that I was riding. And yeah, it all ended up wonderful. So he was a very good horse.
Oh
So
wow, that would be such a thrill to ride a horse like that.
it was
Wow.
pretty fun.
Yeah, cool. Okay, and last question, and we'll start with you, Brian, so that Renee can finish up the podcast for us. If you had just 2 minutes with every horse owner in the world, what would you want them to know?
Oh, wow. Listen to your horse. And I guess this goes back to what you were kind of saying regarding the horse's attitude. And, if you do have that horse who's always well behaved and then suddenly is acting cranky, usually there's a reason for that. And don't try and hide the issue. Try and figure out what's causing it and work to resolve the issue. Again, I think it was Renee that was saying, if you have this horse who's always really good and then suddenly starts to act cranky, horse owners often do things out of lack of knowledge and you don't know how to handle it. So we're going to force you to ride well. No, there's probably a reason behind it. So again, sometimes remember, this is a living, breathing animal that, like us, probably has good days and bad days, sometimes doesn't feel well. And the way you treat them actually probably tells a lot about yourself. You don't want to be that person. You want to be that person.
Mm.
Mhm.
Mm. Thanks, Ben. And you, Renee, if you had 2 minutes with every horse owner in the world, what would you tell them?
Yeah, I think it actually kind of like builds off of what you were saying, but I was gonna go kind of apart from everything we've discussed today because I think everything we've said is really important, maybe not necessarily groundbreaking, right? But if I actually got to like sit down personally with people, I think it would be really important for them to understand that us as equine scientists are really on their side. Everything we do is really for you and your horse. And I think we've kind of hinted at it. It's like it can be really frustrating and like disheartening to hear about all these things that like don't work, and here's all the things that you're probably doing wrong. And I think sometimes we probably sound like we're nagging, right? And we tell you you're wasting your money, and we tell you your anecdotal evidence doesn't count, right? And we become like the obnoxious people, right, that just tell you what you have to do. But it's really all that we really want you to be successful, and we want your horses to be healthy, and we can all really empathize with the challenges that everyone's facing. And it is kind of tough to give you more preventative strategies than like, here's the magic potion that fixes it all, right? We all wish we had that, but us telling you the things that don't work are really hopefully in your best interest. And with all the preventative things we discussed too, I think it's important to know that joint disease isn't necessarily 100% preventable, like we've talked about, right? So it doesn't mean that you did something wrong. You don't need to necessarily feel guilty about those things. And in a kind of weird turnaround way, I think we're very lucky that we can sit down and talk about joint health for like, what, almost an hour and a half now, because our horses are living long enough that we can talk about their joint health as they age, right? So I think we've made a lot of progress in a lot of areas, but mainly I want horse owners to know that they can, for the most part, hopefully trust science, and that really everything we do is to help them and their horses.
That's so well said, Renee. I love the way that you frame things and the way that you say things. You're such a brilliant scientist, and we really are. I mean, you've been under the tuition of one of the most respected equine scientists in the world. And when I say one of the most, like you're like at the top for me, Brian. So you together, I love your work, and you can absolutely see your care and the fact that you do have the horse's best interests in heart. When I read your paper, the way you write it, and the way that the way that you conduct your research, it absolutely comes through. If anyone does want to read Renee's research and Dr. Brian's research alongside her, I will put links in the show notes so that they can go and find them. But thank you so much again. This is round number 3 for you, Dr. Brian. You're now well and truly the most frequent guest on the Happy Horse Nutrition podcast. So I thank you for that, because it's no small thing to come on and spend time with me. And Renee, thank you. This is your second time, and both times we've gone for, gosh, nearly 2 hours again. It's
absolutely a pleasure being with
it's
you. This is so
wild.
fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And thank you.
I'm with 2 of my favorite people in the world right now, so this is a great thing.
And thank you for the work that you, like, truly, Renee, like I truly thank you for the work that you've done in this space, because I think it's so important, and it's so good to have this research out now into the horse industry.
Thank you. I mean, it means a lot. I'm glad to. It's so nice to do it. And it's nice to know that it's well received. Like Dr. Nielsen was talking about before, it looks like our article is getting shared, it's getting out there, and like that's really like the main goal is, to be able to actually communicate with the horse owners and get that information out there. It's not just to say we did this thing and wrote a paper, right?
Yeah, and it's already being written about. I should have shared it with you. I read like a summary already of your paper written by, I think it was another nutritionist. I can't remember who it was now, but yeah. So it's getting out there.
Yeah.
And I'm sure
Yeah,
it
that's
will.
amazing.
So thank you. Thank you. And we will, when you do your corticosteroid research, Renee, I'd love to have you back again to discuss that one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for having us, Nerida. It's been a blast.
Yes, thank you so much.
So there you have it, joint health from every ankle. The science of what is actually happening inside your horse's joints, why movement and nutrition matter so much more than any supplement on the market, and why the decisions you make right now, regardless of your horse's age, can make a genuine difference to how sound and comfortable they are for the rest of their life. For me, the biggest takeaway from this conversation is that so much of this is in our hands. Joint disease is not inevitable, and the best thing you can do is feed a balanced diet, keep your horse moving, and pay attention when they are trying to tell you something is not right. If you want help making sure your horse's diet is actually balanced, and not just in terms of calories, but all of those minerals we talked about today that you simply cannot see by looking at your horse, that is exactly what My Happy Horse was built for. Head to myhappy.horse to find out more. And if you got something out of today's episode, please share it with a fellow horse owner who you think would find it useful. And if you haven't already, hit follow so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for being here, and we will see you next time.